Our presenter today is Dr. Ryan Klein. He's assistant professor in environmental horticulture, and his focus is trees in the urban landscape. And Ryan, I went by the tree unit the other day off of Southwest 23rd, and it seems like you are really getting your living laboratory up and going. So, what an awesome farm that you have, and I'm so excited about some of the research that you have coming up. You're planting a lot of trees out there, so that's great. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you, Ryan, and you can start sharing. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to be here, and I will send you questions for clarity, but mostly we're going to go ahead and save our questions until the end. So welcome to the State Master Gardener webinar.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, Wendy. See, I pretty much do anything related to trees in the urban landscape, trees and risk, trees and climate change, natural disasters, best management practices, pruning, planting, all the above, you name it. I'm interested in it as long as it's trees in urban areas. Today, we're going to be talking about planting and some of the things that impact the success and establishment performance of our urban trees. All right, so just briefly, and I'm sure a lot of people on here are pretty versed in the benefits that trees provide. We're going to kind of just do a quick overview of that, look at selecting trees, how we should be evaluating trees as far as quality goes, go through the planting process, and then depending on how much time we have at the end, we'll just look at some of the research my lab's doing in relation to the topic currently. So, trees provide a variety of benefits. Again, I'm sure most of these are familiar to us, but environmental, economic, social benefits. When a tree fails in the urban landscape, it can pose some sort of significant consequences as far as, public health and safety. People can get injured. Sometimes deaths occur, disruption of services, stuff like that. But the thing to keep in mind is that the risk of injury or death as the result of one of these tree failures is extremely low. So in the US, it's about 35 people a year die from some sort of, freak tree failure occurrence. And then in the UK, it's about 6. So, I mean, if you compare that to things that we actively partake in, driving vehicles, some people are smokers, extreme sports, whatever. Very low likelihood that somebody's going to die, but a lot of times this gets blown out of proportion in the news and stuff like that. So about 80% or more of the U.S. population live in urban areas, and the urban forests equate to just under 4 billion trees at a value of about $2.4 trillion. So some of the ecosystem services that result from this, we have reduced energy costs to the tune of about $2 billion a year, improved air quality. So we're taking air pollution and carbon out of the air, and that's about $4 billion annually. And then mitigating climate change, as a part of that stored carbon is about 14 billion a year. And that's going to become even more important moving forward as development is kind of, continuing to take over all parts of not only Florida, but, any areas that are somewhat urban are becoming more urbanized. So, something to consider moving forward. And just to that point, in Florida, there was the survey done by 1,000 Friends of Florida where they kind of projected what 2070 would look like as far as urban sprawl throughout the state. So essentially, over that 60-year period from 2010 to 2070, the population's almost going to double. They're expecting about 34 million people by that point. So about a third of the state you'll see there on the right image is going to be developed. You're going to see population booms in coastal areas because everybody wants to be near the water. You're going to see areas that available land is cheaper and more available. That's another place where you're going to see lots of development occur. But, along with this, we need to make sure that we're keeping trees in mind, with the design choices that we make, and also trying to maximize the benefits associated with those trees while minimizing some of the inputs, financial, and then, some of the associated risks. So we just need to be strategic with how we're designing the urban landscape for future growth, development, again, and with the climate change aspect, this is becoming more important. So speaking of climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that we'll see an increase in temperatures by the end of the 21st century in the tune of about 2.7 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. I've been seeing things recently in the news that we've already come close or slightly surpassed some of the minimum thresholds that we were trying to avoid. Things are starting to speed up a little bit quicker than they even anticipated. And a lot of it has to do with either our inability to kind of dial back some of the things that are causing this or mitigate some of the issues that are currently pressing. So with this climate change, we're going to see an increase in the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. So we're obviously seeing that here in Florida with the hurricanes. Out west, you're seeing wildfires, droughts are happening all over the country, pest and disease outbreaks. And these are all things that can pose some sort of risk to our urban forests and canopy cover. Here in the southeast, we're going to have warmer minimum temperatures, less precipitation. So as a result, species migration, whether it be something that, we impose based off of planting trees in whatever areas of the landscape, or naturally, things are going to change, and species that are currently adapted to certain areas might not be as fit for those areas moving forward, and then other species might actually perform better. So if you just look at this, this graph here is from Davy Tree Experts. So the top left, this is for best case scenario from the time period of 1980 to 2009. And you can see that, down even in South Florida, we're seeing hardiness zones in the 10A, 10B. And then as you look over time, 2010 to 2039, you're going to see those start to shift north. So those higher hardiness zones are creeping up further into the state. You go to 2040 to 2069, the bottom left, creeping up even further. And then as you get up to the end of the century, again, you're starting to see some of those higher hardiness zones further up in the state. So ultimately, that could dictate some of the plants that we're able to grow in these areas. And certain species that, maybe we plant heavily already might not be fit for some areas that they're currently in large abundance. And then when you look at some of the research specific to trees and climate change, trees are going to be more vulnerable in these urban areas to those pest and disease outbreaks, late spring frost damage, drought stress. But there's been some recent research that's tried to look at species distribution in these areas for projected temperatures to see if we can maybe get ahead of that. My lab's working on a project in line with that as well. But it's kind of that, forward thinking about just, if this does happen, where are we going to be at? And then how can we manage accordingly as far as our urban forests? So that, coupled with the already harsh conditions that trees grow in these urban areas, typically trees are going to grow poorly in the urban landscape if infrastructure is not developed to accommodate future root growth. So think of it as, that 3-inch tree works in that little 4-foot wide planting strip when it's planted, but then, over 4, 5, 10 years starts to outgrow that space. And, as that tree becomes middle-aged and, makes its way to maturity, it's definitely outgrown the space, damages infrastructure. A lot of times when they replace the infrastructure, the tree's damaged. It's a vicious cycle. So, we got to do better with designing for long-term performance. But, things that affect this would be the soil quality, small planting spaces, the urban heat island effect. It's causing drought-like conditions, that construction damage I mentioned. Sometimes it's either a lack of maintenance or improper maintenance. So pruning goes a long way, to help develop good structures and make them more tolerant to, things like extreme wind events. So typically urban trees are going to have a shorter life expectancy than, if you have a tree in an open area like a park. Anytime there's impervious surfaces and small planting spaces, it's going to potentially reduce the life of the tree. And then certain things will do well in these areas, and unfortunately they end up getting planted heavily. So we got to, make sure we don't plant monocultures. The one thing I'm always curious about, if something comes to Florida that affects live oaks, maybe sudden oak death or oak wilt, we might be in a world of trouble because we plant live oak extremely heavily here in the state. So we could lose some of our canopy cover in a lot of our cities as a result. And then less common species, underutilized species, they're either not being grown, they're grown in small numbers, they're hard to source. So that can be challenging, if you're trying to diversify some of your plant palette. So, the big key is planting the right tree in the right place. Long term, it's going to save time and money, maximize the benefits of those trees that you plant rather than, planting and cutting down every 10, 15 years because the tree's stressed out and outgrew its space. Tons of resources online for that. We just finished wrapping up an online tool. Basically, it's a tree selector tool where you can put in all the information specific to your site and it'll kick back a list of that are suitable species. So if you just type in trees or Florida trees, IFAS, it'll be a website that should be one of the top couple that pop up, and you can go on there and kind of play around with it. We're going to be putting out an EDIS document here, hopefully in the next couple of months. We got it written, we just need to submit it, but it's a tutorial on how to use the site. So it kind of walks you through step by step on how to use it. And like I said, it's just good for finding right tree, right place. But essentially, when we don't do that and the survival rates are low, we lose those long-term benefits. The other thing is you want to start out with high quality nursery stock in order to get off on the right foot. As far as different reasons why we plant trees, things from function for shade, maybe species that are more drought tolerant. Maybe you want something a little bit more fast growing, so we're concerned about the growth rate. Form, whether it be X current, that nice central leader, maybe you want something a little bit bushier and kind of a D current form. Wood strength, I think that's important down here as far as, for storm resilience, things like that. The other thing we need to be concerned with, and again, this is, all before we even get to the point of digging the hole in the ground, the site evaluation. So first off, you want to make sure you're planting something that's going to grow well at your site, but you also want to make sure that establishment and long-term success happen. So, there's things like above ground site attributes that you need to be concerned of, access to sunlight. Is it in a wind tunnel? Are there overhead utilities near a building or signs? And then below ground site attributes, things related to the soil, so texture, pH, compaction, is there proper drainage? And then depending on, if that's the site for you and you're really wanting to plant there, are there any modifications you can make to the site to improve, the potential establishment and success of that planting? Potentially things like, moving lights and wires, soil amendments, improving drainage, stuff like that. And then also you want to think about what you're going to have to do to that tree after it's in the ground. So irrigation, pruning, fertilization, pest control, potentially. All right, so here's an example of some small planting spaces. The tree is going to become stressed out, potentially stunt growth, lower survival rates. I was just in Orlando last night, and I saw some live oaks that were probably about 10, 12-inch diameter, and they were planted in these little about 3x3 cutouts, and they were starting to die back up top, similar to that image there on the left. I'm guessing, they don't have much longer left because you can just tell that they're stressed out. They're in a, compacted soil, small planting space area, and they're just not going to perform well long term. So it's things like that we want to avoid. Obviously, we want to plant street trees, but if there's not enough soil volume there, you're kind of just spinning your tires. So, things we can do rather than that small little planting island on the left there, you're better off, maybe with the image in the center there, kind of a peninsula where roots can get out into the planting strip behind it. Or, if you can do a planting strip, you're going to be better off yet because the roots can go the entire distance of the strip. But essentially, when you have the image to the left, you're basically planting the tree in a container. The roots are confined, they're deflecting against the infrastructure and poor stability and poor survival and performance of the tree. So, this is a common issue. I kind of alluded to this earlier where you have that, 3 or 4 inch tree planted in that 4-foot strip, works at planting, but then, 20, 30 years down the road, you have lifting sidewalks, the trees possibly, being damaged from growing into the infrastructure or damaged once it's replaced. So essentially, we just want to make sure that the tree fits long term, so have future growth in mind. But trees have this rapid zone of taper where the buttress roots are enlarged and they quickly transition to these lateral ropey roots. And you need to make sure that you're accounting for this at maturity. So, make sure the soil volume is large enough for future tree growth. So there's been some research on trunk flare diameter, and they found that trunk flare diameter increases proportionally with DBH. So if you look at the table or the figure there on the left, that kind of shows that proportional, growth of both. So some planting recommendations were made based off of this, and what they determined was that you needed basically 4 foot on each side of the tree, plus the trunk diameter or trunk flare diameter at maturity, as far as how big the planting space should be. So just for example, a live oak, if you got a 69-inch live oak, which is a large tree, you should have at least a 16-foot wide planting strip. I see live oaks all the time that are in the 40-inch diameter range, planted in, like 6-foot strips. So, I mean, they obviously can make it to that size, but it's going to become harder and harder over time when we start to have these extra pressures, such as climate change, and as development is making situations a little bit more harder on trees than maybe it used to, because it's a little bit more aggressive and compact and all that. And then when you look at smaller species, like a crepe myrtle, an 8-inch crepe myrtle should have at least a 3-foot strip. And I see crepe myrtles that size all the time planted in, 18, 20-inch little pieces of grass. So obviously trees are resilient, but we can do a lot better. And, in doing better, I think we can maximize those benefits long term, especially against some of these future adversities. So this is what we get with those small planting spaces. Like I said, it's like growing in a large container. The roots deflect, and then you have some sort of storm event, and we see these in the news all the time, these trees in these small planting spaces that go over. And like I said, it's a combination of just the lack of space, and then also sometimes the roots are damaged when replacing infrastructure. So we want to design spaces that are more accommodating to these, future root growth. Structural soils, suspended sidewalks, maybe alternative surface materials. You've seen maybe that rubber asphalt before, or like brick pavers, stuff like that, soil cells. These are all going to help not only support people walking on them, but then also allow for roots to kind of spread out further than we normally would if we just have a 4x4 cutout. And a lot of the times you don't even know these design features have been put in because they're underneath the ground and it covers it up and it looks like it's a small planting space, and you're amazed at how well the tree's doing or whatever, but they've designed something. Austin, Texas has a real good example of this, where they have suspended sidewalks and they just cut out around the trunk of the tree as the tree gets larger. But it's going to increase the lifespan of the tree and then reduce some of those infrastructure conflicts and the expenses in repairing the maintenance or the infrastructure. So here was that website I referred to earlier, but essentially we have a way where you can go in and put in all your site conditions and characteristics specific to the tree that you're looking for. Another one is just characteristics. So if you want pink flowers, a certain hardiness zone, whatever, you can check all these boxes. The one where you put in all the site information, it's going to prompt you with lots of questions, usually around 30, 35 questions by the time it'll kick back a list of species. But it takes into account things like invasive potential, hardiness zone, all the tree and site characteristics, and then it'll basically kick out a IFAS fact sheet at the very end. And then just in case you're unaware of this, but most of the tree fact sheets that are on IFAS currently were generated from the original version of this site back in the 90s by Dr. Gilman and Dr. Beck. And then I was just tasked with revamping it after it went offline a couple years ago. We got a grant for it. But here's essentially what I was talking about. So the stuff on the left is all the information that's built into the system. I think of it as like a spider web, but there's hundreds of questions and rules. If this, then this type scenarios. In the top right, that is the characteristic selector where you can check all these different boxes related to things you're interested in, from the site conditions or the environment, different uses for the tree, shade tree, and then different attributes related to the actual species. But again, it comes back to that right tree, right place. And then we updated some of the information like invasive potential, hardiness zone, scientific names, some things that change periodically. Most of the information static, and then we added new high resolution photos. All right, so when we're talking about planting trees, just kind of in general, the basic root form, there's primary functions from anchorage, storage, conduction, absorption. But basically, roots are going to grow in areas where there's available moisture and oxygen. So again, we need to make sure that the site we're planting them in is conducive to their growth. Roots can spread, 2 to 3 times as wide as the crown on a decurrent tree. So obviously the scenario in the bottom left there, that's, a great growing condition for a tree, lots of room to grow above and below. But more commonly, we see the image on the right here where you have, utility lines above, small planting strip, improper pruning. So trees are more, subjected to situations like that in the urban environment rather than the open planting space. Typically, trees are going to grow in the top 12 to 18 inches of the soil. So some of the things we do as far as managing turf can have an impact. Fertilizers, herbicides, competition with other resources like water and stuff like that. And then deep roots, in the urban landscape are typically deflected or aborted. A lot of times this happens, when they're growing trees out in liners and as you're shifting them up into containers and stuff like that. Other things that can affect this, soil type, water level, pH, salinity, stuff like that. It can also be deflected from compacted soil. So things like we see in the urban environment, poor quality nursery stock. So you can see in that top right there, there's an imprint from maybe a 1-gallon container. So a lot of those roots weren't able to get out into the larger containers. They shifted it. And then obviously infrastructure, curbs, sidewalks, buildings. So we commonly see trees with these root defects fail. So when you have your circling, girdled, bent, kinked roots, these are roots that are not getting out into the surrounding landscape to stabilize the tree. And then we have some sort of wind event and you'll see these trees go down. So, we want to make sure we're addressing these at every container shift. So like I said, you might have an imprint from circling roots at a 1-gallon container. If you don't correct that defect, it's just going to keep persisting and getting bigger as the tree gets bigger with every shift. All right, so here's an imprint on the left just to show you an example of that. And left long enough on the tree, they become large and they can potentially lead to stability issues or kill the tree by cutting off the vascular tissue if it chokes the trunk of the tree. So what we can do here with the girdling roots, you can just use some snips, some pruners, and take care of those. When you have circling roots around the exterior of the root ball, you can either slice them, make 5 or 6 radial slices inward towards the trunk of the tree, or you can shave off the exterior a couple inches. You can use spade, machete, handsaw, variety of tools. Only problem with slicing is depending on where you make your cuts. So those radial cuts, think like a bike spoke. You might not be cutting the root to where it's going to be growing straight out into the landscape. You might cut it at a point where it's still circling. So you're not really correcting the defect as well as you could maybe if you were shaving. So if you're not familiar with shaving, if the video works here, you'll see what that looks like real quick. There we go. So you'll do, a couple inches on the exterior. And again, you're trying to get those defects when they hit the side of the container and start circling, but you're cutting back far enough to where you're getting a part of the root that's growing out straight at that point. And you'll do this all the way around the root ball, and then you will flip it over on its side, and then you'll get the bottom because a lot of times you'll have roots that'll deflect and go down. So then you're also getting those as they're kind of circling around the bottom there. And this has been done to thousands of trees out at my lab. A lot of them that predate me, and then hundreds since I've been there. And we've only had one tree die as a result of doing this, and it was because the quality of the nursery stock was so bad when we went to shave the root ball, it just fell apart, and there was an imprint from about a 1 gallon tree. So here you got an image of a shaved and not shaved, and you can just see that, the not shaved root ball, it's kind of a mess. It's all knotted up in there, kind of circling around, crossing over. The shaved, you get a lot more roots growing outward, that are going to get into the surrounding landscape and help stabilize that tree and establish it quicker. So, as far as quality of nursery stock, we talked about the below ground portion. There's also the above ground piece as far as, what the structure looks like. But we have grades and standards here in Florida. It's not mandated. It's a recommendation system essentially. But, there's 4 tiers from Florida Fancy, Florida #1, Florida #2, and a Cull. And for the most part, there's no reason why we should not be planting Florida #1s and fancies. It's recommended in a lot of municipal codes, but unfortunately, it's not always enforced. And then you get problematic situations like we've seen as far as poor quality trees and potential failures down the road. So, we just want to make sure that, before we put that hole in the ground, we're starting off with a high quality product. A tree free of defects, both in the root ball and above. You want a nice central leader. And these are going to be trees that are going to perform better in the landscape. So, things that we want to consider is not only making sure that that tree is a good fit for the site conditions, but what production methods were used. What size is the tree going to be at, mature state, the root ball characteristics, and then those above ground portions. The nice dominant leader, and it's something you need to maintain over time. You can start off with the highest quality tree, but if you don't do any structural pruning, every couple of years throughout the life of the tree, it's gonna kind of just revert back to a poor structure. And that's because trees grown in open areas have access to sunlight on all sides. If you're in a forested setting, they got competition, so it's going to grow nice and straight with a central leader. But in the urban area, we get lots of large, low growing limbs that can be potentially, defects later on, or large pruning cuts in order to get vertical clearance. And that's when it becomes problematic. We need to be more proactive with our maintenance. Instead, a lot of times we're more reactive. And as far as, species selection, we plant a lot of the same things, but this is by no means an all-inclusive list, and I'll give credit to Mark Frank on this. I'm not super well versed in all the underutilized species in Florida. I typically lean on Mark because he is a great resource as far as that goes. So he recommended some species in different size groups here. So if you're looking at some smaller species, the American hornbeam, torchwood, hop tree, these might be some options for you depending on where you're at in the state. Some medium-sized trees here: sweet bay, inkwood, Japanese blue oak, and then some mature trees. You got your mockernut hickory, black gum, bluff oak, or spruce pine. And I'm on the tree advisory board for the city of Gainesville, and we've been trying to incorporate some more of these underutilized species in there. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of people growing them. And when they do grow them, it's in smaller quantities. And then the other thing is, with a lot of these underutilized species, grades and standards have not made their way into some of those nurseries yet. So there's definitely some improvements that we can make, but I think part of it is getting, an interest in these trees and developing a market. All right, so now we're going to jump into the planting portion of all this. So there's the planting BMPs out there. This is a good guiding document as far as all the things you need to do to plant a tree. From making sure that you match the right tree to the site, and then all the things you do from the time you break the ground to the time you water it. And then, so prior to planting, we considered all those different things that we've seen in the slides up to this point. So, in Florida, we can pretty much plant year round. Obviously, if we're planting during the high dry part of the year, we're going to make sure that irrigation is regularly applied to make sure that it establishes. If you're up in more temperate climates, typically fall and spring are the best times of year to plant, rather than doing it peak summer. Again, you can do those things. It's just more aftercare. The other thing is, selecting the nursery stock. So, maybe we want to plant bare root. These are typically smaller trees. They're going to be field grown, dug without soil, so you can ship a lot of them really easily. You harvest them while they're dormant, and then they can be planted in the late winter, early spring. Balled and burlap. So these are going to be field grown and spaded out. They come in all different sizes. The biggest part here is timing the dig is the most important thing, because you don't want to stress the trees out. You also want to let them sit for a while, harden them off. This is one of the most common methods used in colder climates. But essentially, you want to make sure that the root ball to trunk diameter ratio is in line. You don't want to, have a 12-inch diameter trunk and it's only a 24-inch root ball. So basically, you want to retain as much of the root system as possible when you're spading these out. There's been some studies done out there that, somewhere in the range of you're losing up to 95% of the root system when you're spading trees out for balled and burlap trees. And if you think about it, how far the roots can extend beyond the drip line, it kind of makes sense how much of that root system you're losing. Container grown trees, plastic, sometimes wood boxes. Basically, you want to make sure that the tree's the appropriate size for the final container that it's in. Again, that kind of root to shoot ratio. These can be planted in any season with minimal root loss, because all the roots are in the container at that point. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're planting these, you typically want to plant them a little bit higher, because the substrate that they're grown in will actually settle quite a bit. And these also require a little bit more frequent irrigation, just because typically, they're grown above ground and they require more irrigation throughout the life cycle at the nursery. As far as some other things to consider, drainage. You want to make sure you don't have excess water standing in the hole, creating anaerobic conditions. So you might have to address that maybe with drainage tiles, or putting a layer of gravel in, vertical holes, things like that, French drains. And then the width of the hole. Typically, if you have high quality soil, you don't want to dig any wider than you need to. Poor quality soil, sometimes you'll dig twice the width of the root ball. It'll be wider at the top, because remember, the roots are going to be in the top 18 to 12 inches anyway. And this is going to help those roots get out into that surrounding soil a little bit quicker. And then depth. This is one of the most common mistakes, planting too deeply. So typically you want to plant a couple inches above grade. You're always better off planting higher than lower. And then the other thing is, is there any excess soil on top of the root ball? And we'll touch on that here in a second. So here's that example. So you pulled back the burlap from the balled and burlap tree. You can't find the trunk flare. So what you need to do is you need to remove all the soil until you can find that trunk flare. And you can see with that blue arrow there was, 2-3 inches of soil above the trunk flare. So if you were to plant the tree level with the ground or a little bit deep at that point, that trunk flare is buried even further. And when the trunk flare is buried, you have opportunities for circling roots, adventitious roots to develop. And then you could basically choke off the vascular tissue of the tree. Can result in stability issues as well. So we want to make sure we're planting just slightly higher. And like I said, this is really important with containerized trees too. But remove all soil you need to until you can find that trunk flare. If you're buying a tree from a nursery and you don't see the trunk flare, definitely move that soil around a little bit. We've done a couple studies out at my lab to where there's been times where we've had to dig down 6+ inches in order to find that trunk flare. And that just leads to a bad situation down the road. As far as the soil, again, right tree right place. You want to make sure you're planting something that's adapted to that type of soil. You might need to get some sort of soil analysis to see, if there's any nutrient deficiencies, stuff like that. But some people will amend soils either with organic matter for water holding capacity. Biochar is kind of a new hot topic right now. We still don't know exactly what it does. There's been a lot of kind of one-off studies, not a lot you can compare to one another. We're working on that right now at my lab. But essentially, assuming you want to plant whatever species, make sure that it's adapted to that soil condition, because even if you amend the immediate hole, once those roots grow out beyond the planting hole, those amendments really don't help anymore. So the entire area would need to be amended at that point. So just match the species to the site. One thing you might need to be concerned with, not so much in sandy soils, but maybe more in clay soils, is glazing and drying. So glazing is just caused by, the shovel or digging equipment kind of hardening off or glazing over the hole. And then the drying is just from the hole being exposed for long periods of time. So real simple fix, just, break that up before you fill in the planting hole. But that could be a potential barrier for roots penetrating the surrounding soil. And then as far as preparing the root ball, just make sure you remove any synthetic materials. So, that twine around the base of the trunk of the tree. If you have synthetic burlap, cut as much of it off as possible. As far as wire basket goes, there's lots of different camps on that, but we've done a study on that, and it was a 7-year study, and basically we didn't find any, detrimental effects from leaving the wire basket on, at least in a 7-year period, as far as, growth, stability, anything like that. And actually the trees that had the wire baskets left on fared better following a windstorm up in the Midwest. And that was because, the root ball was held intact. But more research needs to be done, like most things. That's one of the things we're limited to in the tree world, is a lot of our studies are less than 3 years. We just don't have a lot of long-term data. So that's one thing I'm going to try and work towards with my lab. But synthetic materials we have found, can girdle, roots as they're trying to grow through. They might be able to grow through, but eventually they're going to get choked out as they put on diameter. Whereas trees have been found to basically engulf wire baskets and then just continue to grow. So, we talked about defects earlier, but this should be something that if you have a high quality tree should be addressed by the growers, before it even comes to the site. But if you do have any of these defects that are correctable at the site and it's not warranting of rejecting the tree, definitely do it before planting. But if they're too far gone, you should probably be rejecting the tree. But again, no circling, girdling, crossing, kinked roots. And then once in the planting hole, stabilize the tree. You can lightly pack in some soil. Don't compact it, because again, it'll keep the roots from growing out into the landscape as easily. And then, maybe you want to water it in as far as to break up the soil a little bit, get it to settle. You can create a soil ring around there, so when it rains or if you're irrigating it, it can kind of puddle up over the root ball to keep it moist. And then again, make sure you're planting it slightly above grade and exposing the trunk flare. Mulch can be good and it can also be bad. In the image here, that's way too much. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that are really good at selling mulch, and it just keeps piling up year after year. Some people like that fresh mulch look. If you're going to put mulch on annually, you might consider removing the previous year's mulch. Because anything over, maybe 2-3 inches, it's too thick. It can actually prevent water from getting to the roots sometimes, depending on, how much rain you're getting. And then it can also, as it breaks down over time, promote some of those adventitious root growth, which then can lead to, circling, girdling roots. And it can also, be habitat for rodents and fungi and stuff like that. So just easy thing to, not do is pile up too much mulch. It's good though for preventing any sort of cultural stressors and damages, like hitting it with the lawnmower or the string trimmer, stuff like that. And then pruning at planting. Hopefully we're getting high quality trees. Maybe you make a snip here or there. Maybe there's a broken branch from transport, stuff like that. But at planting, you shouldn't have much pruning to do. Again, if there's a little bit to do, definitely address it, to make sure you're going to have a nice structure. But you shouldn't be doing major amounts of pruning at planting. Support systems, staking, guying, bracing, only use these if necessary. The biggest thing is if you are going to use any sort of support systems or maybe trunk protection or something like that, to remove it in a timely fashion. Typically with staking, you want to remove it after a year. It could start to girdle the trunk depending on what the material is that you're, staking it with. And then the other thing is if you leave staking on too long, trees don't develop taper because they're not moving back and forth in the wind. And they're not as structurally sound at that point, more prone to failure. The protection aspect, if you leave it on too long, it can be problematic. Like I said, you can develop favorable conditions for pests and disease, which could then injure the tree. So once it's no longer needed, try to remove that. And then just kind of an overview of everything that we've kind of talked about here. Evaluate your site conditions above and below ground, making sure you're digging the hole the appropriate size depending on the soil type. Identifying and removing any of those root defects, planting a couple inches a little bit high and exposing the trunk flare because the tree is going to settle over time. Straighten, stabilize the tree, remove all synthetic materials because those can potentially girdle the trunk over time, or some of the roots that are trying to grow out into the surrounding soil. Backfill, you can tamp but don't compact it. If you're going to apply mulch, only a couple of inches. And then the pruning, the staking, anything like that only if necessary. But if you do use it, make sure you remove it within the first year. And then when we're looking at the establishment period, water stress is usually one of the biggest issues. So until roots establish, water can be potential issue. So this is dependent, root growth that is dependent on things like species, soil type, oxygen levels, moisture levels, other site conditions. But typically a lack of water is the most limiting factor as far as tree health and growth. And then you have soil compaction. This is also going to reduce growth and establishment. And this is kind of dependent on the soil type and moisture content as well. And then overall, when we're talking about root development, this is going to happen a little bit quicker in warmer soils, and colder soils it could take a little bit longer. So depending on the time of year you plant it, this might be slowed or halted for a little bit. But managing soil moisture and soil aeration, this is going to be the best way for you to promote a healthy root development on your newly planted tree during establishment. And then just some general recommendations here for the establishment period, depending on where you're at in the state and, what size the tree is at planting. Just for example, for a less than 2-inch caliper tree, you might water it for vitality daily for 2 weeks, and then every other day for 2 months, and then weekly until established. And then when you get a larger tree for vitality, it might be daily for 6 weeks, every other day for the first 5 months, and then weekly until established. So this is in the grades and standards book. And if you just Google Florida grades and standards, there would be a free PDF you can pull up and just do a word find establishment, and there will be recommendations in there. As far as maintenance, again, watering is key. Fertilization, I don't usually recommend it at planting, especially, if you're shaving the root ball or it was recently spaded or whatever. It could have adverse effects and maybe scorch the canopy. Maybe down the road it could be needed if there's some nutrient deficiencies that's been identified in the soil. But, ideally, if you're planting the right tree at the right place, that should not be problematic. Anti-transference, pest management, pruning, again, if you need them. The biggest one there would be the pruning as far as, being proactive with developing a nice structure from an early age and throughout the life of the tree. Planting specifications, if you're interested in that from a municipal or a grower standpoint, developer, there's lots of recommendations and an editable document that you can use if you go to the IFAS Landscape Plants website. You can see the link there on the bottom highlighted in green. So if you're interested in something like that, it's another resource. But it has to do with, sourcing, inspecting materials, storage, planting, watering, mulching, maintenance, cleanup, disposal of materials, stuff like that. So kind of wrap this up here. You want to make sure you're selecting a species that matches the site conditions that you have. There's lots of factors that are going to affect the success of the planting. So site conditions, do you have any design solutions to mitigate some sort of site issue, the quality of nursery stock, following those proper planting procedures, any sort of aftercare, and again, water and pruning are the two most important in that regard. And then, addressing these variables is going to help us achieve more resilient and sustainable urban forests. We're going to maximize those benefits in doing so, minimize some of the inputs from a management standpoint, and then minimize some of the risks. The other thing is, when you're talking about sourcing plants, know your growers. There's a lot of really great growers in the state, and then there's maybe some that need a little bit more education. All right, I'm just going to briefly go through some of the stuff we're working on here, just in the aspect of time. So we are doing a comparison of nursery stock quality throughout the state. We picked 15-gallon live oaks because that's, common size tree and a common size species that people can go to the nursery and pick up and throw in their vehicle. We also included the box stores. So there were 7 randomly selected nurseries throughout the state out of 56 that actually sell 15-gallon live oak, and then Home Depot and Lowe's, because people buy stuff at the box stores. And we're basically looking at the quality of the trees, at purchase, and then if we do nothing to them, and then the quality of trees at purchase, and then if we do root treatments, so shave the root ball and then structurally prune them. And we're looking at these over about a 4-year time frame before we're going to write this up. So a little bit longer study, just to kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. But if you just look at the top image there, these were all 15-gallon live oaks, and they ranged anywhere from somewhere around 1 inch in caliper up to almost 3 inches, and somewhere in like the 5-foot range up to almost like 13 or 14 inches. So the size and the quality of these trees were all over the place. No consistency whatsoever, and very few actually kind of fit in line with what grades and standards is recommending. And this is just, some of that information here. I'm just going to skip over it. I will, if you ever have any questions about it, let me know, but we're hopefully be publishing this in a couple of years. But just for the sake of time, for maybe a question or two. And then we're also doing an irrigation bag comparison to look at establishment. So the tree gator bags, the pyramidal ones you see in the municipalities a lot, and then the tree diapers in the top left there compared to hand watering. So we're doing a cost benefit analysis, looking at establishment rates, and then also stability based off of doing the different root treatments that we discussed. We got several climate change studies, one looking at planting underutilized species across different hardiness zones. We got a biochar study going on right now to look at biochar, compost, synergy between the two, doing nothing to see if it helps with growth and establishment, long-term performance. We're looking at effects of size of planting space, and then distance between plantings on the development of defects. So that is everything I have. I got a couple minutes if you got a couple questions. Otherwise, I will gladly take emails, if anything comes up down the road or whatnot, if you have a lingering question.
Okay, Ryan, we have 20 questions in the box. We're not going to be able to get to them all. We're on a compressed time schedule today. My first question is when can we come to the tree unit for a field day? I'd like to talk with you about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I do probably 8 or 10 of those every year.
Okay.
So yeah, we walk around and we can talk for an hour, or we can talk for 2 hours, but I got probably a dozen or so research trials going on currently. We're adding a couple more yet this year. So I'll probably be up to about 15 next year. But yeah, I mean, we can talk for a while, and I'd be happy to, have anybody that wants to come out. So I do host groups out there for that exact same purpose.
Super. I want to let everybody know that the recording will be posted next week, and Ryan is going to send us a PDF of his slides. So any of the questions that you will have about the, some of the specifics, you'll be able to have access to the slides. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask a couple that will kind of be synergetic together. The question is, should we remove all soil from that root ball before getting planted? And I know what your answer is, but please go ahead and say so.
So you definitely don't want to disrupt the root ball any more than you have to. The big thing is, are there any noticeable defects either on the exterior, on the top? And you definitely want to expose the trunk flare, because a lot of times when the trunk flare is buried under, 3, 4 inches of soil, some of those circling and girdling roots have already started to develop. So when you remove that soil, you want to, take a pair of hand pruners and cut those at that time. And you won't hurt the tree. I've seen girdling roots removed from, mature trees that are the size of my wrist, and you'll hear them pop because there's so much pressure, because as the trunk's growing in diameter, the roots growing in diameter, and they're basically growing against each other. They're not going to fuse. And that can eventually cause dieback up in the canopy. So just removing any of the noticeable defects. I mean, if you have to start tearing the root ball apart because it's so defective, that tree should be going back to wherever you bought it from.
Right. And then are we still going with digging the hole 2 to 3 times as wide as the root ball?
So that's dependent on soil type. So if you have more of like a clay soil, you might want to do that. But sandy soils, I'll be honest with you, you can pretty much dig them the exact same size as the root ball, and you're not going to have any issues with the roots getting out into the surrounding soil.
This is my motion for, but we still are going to go ahead and make sure that we get those roots nice and sliced and loose, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. Basim is wanting to know, if he adds mulch around that tree, how far should he pull that mulch away from the trunk?
Yeah, so and I forgot to touch on that, but you don't want any mulch up against the trunk. So if you can keep it, 8 to 12 inches away, you're gonna be better off. Because again, it just as it breaks down over time, it's going to become soil, and it's kind of similar to having soil build up on the trunk. You get the opportunities for those adventitious roots to start to develop. So yeah, keep it away from the trunk. And as far as how big of a diameter mulch ring, the bigger the better.
Okay. And then and I'm going to let you go, I think, after this one, and then we're going to have everyone else just send their email questions to you directly. Okay.
Okay.
Is there a reason why nurseries do not stock smaller potted trees for their customers? And this is the crux here. Don't younger plants adapt to and grow better in their new environments than the older, well-developed specimens?
Yeah, so there have been plenty of studies that have shown, things in the range of like under 30 gallons typically establish a little bit quicker than, larger trees. Um, but as far as the nurseries selling smaller stuff, I mean, some of them do, some of them don't. I think part of it is their business model. And then, in all reality, there's less money in smaller plant material as well. So it just depends on where you're looking, but you can get some smaller stuff. We'll occasionally buy in like 3 and 5 gallon trees and then grow them out ourselves up to 45 gallons before we plant them. But yeah, it just depends on what you're looking for. Unfortunately, availability can be problematic depending on size, and species you're looking for.
And so this will truly be the last one. And the question is about the Florida grades and standards. And I think, speaking to your work with municipalities and helping to set codes and the appropriate tree sizes and the tree standards being followed for our communities in Florida, do you are able to contribute to that knowledge?
Yeah, so I'm on the tree advisory board for the city of Gainesville. So, we do have situations where we have opportunities to try to revise some of the language in code. I've had several conversations with Alachua County about some of their code revisions, stuff like that. I get reached out to by HOAs all the time, which they kind of can circumvent some of the city and county regulations depending on, the HOA rules and how those were set up. But I do have those conversations. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's after the fact. I mean, there is some, changes that'll be made that'll help some future stuff. But the difficulty is any sort of code revisions can take 2, 3, 4 years sometimes. And
Mhm.
by the time, you get it to where it's accepted and moved on to the next level, city commissioners can have changed. And sometimes that can become a setback. And so yeah, it's a challenging system to kind of make meaningful change in.
Okay, Ryan, I'm going to let you go, but I know that some of your research that you're doing at UF is going to drive the future of what our tree canopy looks like in Florida. So thank you
Awesome.
so
Thank
much
you.
for being with us today. And we're going to come see you for field day. All right. Thank
100%.
you.
Yeah. As long as I'm available, I'm glad to do it. So, all
We're going to do it. Okay.
right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ryan.
Wendy.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it. Bye
everybody.
bye.